Anyway, Rich turned up at our house and I challenged him to a game of table tennis, thinking I'd probably beat him. But I think he was quite generous. He allowed me to get about 4 points, I think. So anyway, that was my first introduction to Rich, and then got to know him a bit. And after a few months, he came and asked me a very, very difficult question, which I had to quickly think about and not share my thoughts, because he said, could he marry my daughter Ruth? And I thought, Rich, you don't know what on earth you're taking on. Anyway, they did get married, and they've now got 2 lovely little boys who will be coming to see us later today, I think. Anyway, Rich, I'm not going to say any more. You better come up, because I don't want to steal your thunder. And anyway, here's Rich, and he can tell you all about whatever he's going to say. All yours, Rich.
Thank you so much. Hi there, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. Is that all right? Is that sounding good? Yes, let me just talk to you a little bit about me. This is me, that's Ruth, my wife, and our 2 boys, got a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, Zephaniah and Raphael. So a little bit about me. I grew up in Pakistan. My dad was a civil engineer there, and that's where I grew up. Moved back to the UK when I was about 12, and I did my teenage years in Cambridge. And I then went off to university at Southampton and had the opportunity to join the University Air Squadron. And through all of that experience, my plan was to go and become an outdoor pursuits instructor and do something with the sports degree that I was using. And in the end, my plan went horribly wrong because I so enjoyed the flying that I ended up joining the Air Force. So, but also I'm a Christian. My parents grew me up sort of learning all the Bible stories, and so my faith is a real part of who I am. And I'm just here today briefly just to talk to you a little bit about what I do, which is flying helicopters, and a little bit about my faith. So there'll be a few stories, and maybe I can take questions at the end. So without further ado, this is what I used to do. So it's fly Chinook helicopters. So I joined the Air Force in 2004, and I was in the Royal Air Force for 11 years. Flight Lieutenant Richard Anderson, that was my title. And we did a number of sort of years of doing flying training, on first a fixed wing, and then a single-engined helicopter, then a multi-engined helicopter, and then onto the Chinook. And it was a 6-month conversion training, and having finished that, 8 weeks later, I found myself out in Afghanistan. And we had, basically we were a taxi service for the army. Although I was Royal Air Force, our main job was to pick people up and drop them off, all up and down sort of Helmand province. So that was kind of my main role. Just show you, that was me. I was about 26 at the time. That was my first deployment in Afghanistan. And as part of our deployment cycle, we had a sort of a 2-month recovery program where once we'd come back to the UK, we'd spend 2 months doing a little bit of annual leave, a little bit of UK flying. We'd then go on to 2 months of UK national standby. There's always one Chinook that's available to go anywhere in the country with a 2 hours notice to move. So things like the 7/7 bombings that happened in London, they carried the David Cameron from one side of the city to another because the whole city ground to a halt. Things like some of the national floodings and that sort of thing. There's always one aircraft available to go anywhere in the country. Then we'd move on to 2 months of doing international standby. It was known as R1, so Readiness State 1, and it was 48 hours notice to move anywhere in the world. And that could be things like the Pakistan earthquake, where the Chinooks were sent out there, or things like the Haiti disaster. And again, our flight, our squadron of sort of 30 guys, which are made up of 15 pilots and 15 crewmen, would be sort of available to go anywhere in the world with just 48 hours notice to move. We'd also go all over the world with our training. So so going off to Morocco and Norway and Jordan and joining the Navy and the Army on their exercises, flying off the back of HMS Ocean and HMS Illustrious and flying off the coast of Corsica and Jordan and various different places. We'd then move on to a 2-month program of doing our own pre-deployment training, which we would go to places like Morocco. This is us in Morocco. And the main purpose of that was to get ready in order to go to Afghanistan. So it would involve flying in formation with each other as a 2, 3 or 4 ship Chinooks, flying in both day and night. And most importantly, we'd go to places like Morocco to do a bit of mountain flying, but also go to Jordan, where the dust was very similar to the dust that we'd find in Afghanistan. One of the hardest things to do is to land a helicopter, and a Chinook is even harder, in a really dusty environment. After we'd done that, we'd then move out to Afghanistan and we'd spend the best part of sort of 2 months, 2 to 3 months, in Afghanistan and supporting the army and being a taxi service for them. So all the food, the water, the rations, the supplies, everything that went into the forward operating bases. And at one point there was, I think, 150 forward operating bases in Helmand province, and everything that went in. It was too dangerous to drive. If they did, they would normally get blown up by mines or IEDs, improvised explosive devices, or come under small arms fire. So everything we would fly in as with the Chinook force. So I'll give you a brief video, if I may, of this is us training to do some dust landings. If I can get it to work. So a little bit about the background. So this Chinook has got 30 troops on board, and it's the idea it could be landing in enemy territory, so it's got just a few seconds to throw off as many troops as possible and fly away. If they were to get the landing wrong, the dust cloud that is formed is so huge, it goes up to 200 or 300 feet, that it becomes a real signature, and the enemy would suddenly be like, oh, the Chinook's over there, and they'd start firing. So the idea was for us to land as quickly as possible. As the aircraft comes into land, it's unable to bring the aircraft into a hover, because if it hovers, it kicks up so much dust that we as the pilots couldn't see anything. We'd lose all our visual references, and you might think you're in a hover, but actually you're drifting sideways, and you end up hitting something and rolling over. So we tried to land with a little bit of forward speed, which you'll see, and we had to hit certain heights and speed gates as we go down. So I'll try and talk to you as we do it. There may be some audio. You might not be able to hear it. So the Chinook's coming in. It's setting up to hit its first gate, which is at 100 feet, 30 knots. That's 100 feet there. That's 50 feet at 20 knots. 40, 30, 20, 10, 9, 8, 6, 5, 3, 2, 1. It's on the ground. The crewman is lowering the ramp. First 5 troops are off. 10, 20, 30. 30 troops are up. The ramp is now travelling up, clear above and behind. The pilot's now pulling in power, and he's now lifting out of the dust cloud. And he's now dropped 30 troops off the back of this Chinook. And as you see, the dust cloud is probably about 300 feet high, and it's now left a really big signature for where the aircraft is. So, only because I like showing videos, I'm not going to show you that one. Can I just show you another one as well? So here's one of the forward operating bases. So the various different operating bases used to put a little bit of dust suppression matting, and sometimes they squirt it down with water, sometimes they put down some rocks and stones. So you can see in the corner of your photo, sort of there, is some stones. And if I may, there are some troops. That's 6 troops, sort of 12 troops, and there's a whole bunch more there, and then this dust suppression matting here. And that's the Chinook coming. The quality's not particularly great, but it's only 30 seconds. You'll get the idea of it coming into land. Again, it's trying to hit its various different heights and speeds coming in, but the amount of dust that it causes, it completely covers the troops as we're coming in. But as you can see, the dust is less, and the pilot would be able to make out the ground. So those sort of dust suppression mattings were actually really helpful for us. But if we were landing in the middle of the desert, for some of the operations we were doing, it was particularly tricky. everything we did by day, we'd also have to do by night, which then created various different added complications. But we fly through with night vision goggles, and instead of having your peripheral vision, you're looking through tiny little tubes which narrow what you can see, and it meant that you constantly had to move your head left and right, and then fly in formation with another aircraft, so it sort of added the complication. If you were too far behind the aircraft in front, the dust cloud that they would kick up would get in your way. If you were too far in front, you'd end up landing in the wrong place, so it sort of took huge amounts of practice, which is what our pre-deployment training did. So while we were in Afghanistan, we had a number of we had sort of 4 main taskings that we had to do. One of which was just the day-to-day tasking. And as I said, yeah, everything that was going into the forward operating bases, all the food, water, ammunition, mail, anything that was posted to people out there and all the troops was taken in one of these. And just all day, every day, we would be humping and dumping bits and pieces to the forward operating bases. The other thing that we did was the immediate response team. So there was always one aircraft available with immediate notice to move, with 4 medics in the back, plus 4 troops that would provide a little bit of a cordon. So if you landed in the middle of the desert, they could run out and provide a little bit of force protection around the aircraft. And then it had a crew of 4, which was 2 pilots and 2 crewmen. So there was 12 on board. And it was available to go and pick people up who'd been shot or been blown up by IEDs or had got heat stress, or for some reason they were out and needed picking up. So again, there was an aircraft always available to go and do that. The other thing is from the patrol bases, various patrols would go out and try and help provide a little bit of peace and stability amongst the local populace. While the Taliban were trying to disrupt it, the British troops were trying to provide a little bit of peace and stability. But sometimes they would get pinned down, and they would get ambushed with rocket-propelled grenades and with small arms fire. And the main point of the Helmand Reaction Force was that there was one Chinook always available with 30 extra troops back at Camp Bastion, that at the moment's notice to move, they would all board the aircraft and fly to go and support the patrol that had maybe been pinned. And they would go and land either right on top of them, and they would then be able to fight their way out, or land next to them and provide a little bit of a sort of a pincer movement to be able to squash some of the enemy out. And then the final role that we had in Afghanistan was sort of deliberate operations. And it would be something like a 10-day planning cycle, where they would identify a particular target, whether that was a drug lord, whether that was an IED processing facility, whether they would, and they said, we want to go and stop the production of these weapons that are coming from this particular place. They would then find out where it was, they would monitor where they wanted the aircraft to land, and they'd monitor for patterns of life, and then we'd go through a planning cycle of how we were going to exercise it. And then normally under the cover of darkness, we would land up to 2 or 3 or 4 Chinooks in a particular place. They would go out and knock on someone's door, blow the doors off or whatever, go in, have to blow up whatever it was that they were trying to stop. So anyway, that was one of the other roles that we did. We also had undersung modes that we would try and take. And I've just got 3 stories, if I may, I'd just like to share with you. One of which was taking an undersung load into Kajaki Dam. It was right up at the north of the area of operation. In fact, if I step back one, so I did 5 tours of Afghanistan. And on my first tour, I was a Christian, and before going to Afghanistan, I'd asked all my friends and my family and my church for prayer. And I just said, I really would love your prayers as I go. And I said, partly for safety, for me and all the people I fly with, partly for the local nationals, of which the armed forces were there to provide peace and stability so that they could get on with their lives and that women could have some education and young men could have freedoms. And also that I could be a good witness to people. And during my first tour of Afghanistan, we were flying with various different crews. It got towards the end of my first tour, and everybody during that summer of 2008 had been shot at some point. And we'd often land with bullets going through the blades, going through the side of the aircraft, hitting the belly of the aircraft. And everyone was like, oh, you've been shot at? Oh yeah, I was shot at last week. Yeah, we landed with holes the week before that. And we're like, Rich, you've never been shot at, have you? And I got this little bit of a reputation of being like, if you want to be safe, fly with Rich, because he's not going to get shot at. I wish that had been the same for the whole 5 tours, but that wasn't the case. So that was the first tour. On our second tour of Afghanistan, we were carrying out this underslung load into Kajaki Dam. It was a diesel generator, and they needed it to power all their operations up there. About 5 miles before we landed there, we dropped into low level, because we try and fly as high as possible to stay out of the way, and at some point we had to drop down. We're flying at about 100 feet, maybe 80 feet with this underslung load, and we all felt this little jolt through the aircraft. There was a pregnant pause, and we all looked at each other. And then someone spoke up and was like, did anyone else hear that jolt? Oh yeah, I think I felt it as well. Someone was like, was it a bird strike? Did a bird hit us or something? I don't know why we thought if we're in Afghanistan in a hostile country it was a bird. But anyway, we thought we'd probably been shot at. So we had a quick check of our engines, temperatures and pressures, everything seemed to be working normally. We crossed the lake, which was about the only way we could get to land at the landing site. Landed on, and our crewmen jumped out to go and have a look for holes. Searched high and low, had a look, couldn't find any. So we then flew the 45 minutes back to Camp Bastion. Landed on, and we'd always fly as a pair, just for a little bit of mutual. So both Chinooks landed, we were the lead, took on some refuel, and our crewman Duncan ran around the aircraft to have a look, and he crawled right underneath the Chinook, and he said, yeah, I found one, there's a hole right underneath the belly of the aircraft. Because we didn't know what damage had been caused, we had to then shut down the aircraft. We told our sister aircraft, yeah, I'm really sorry, we have been hit. We're going to have to shut down, jump in a spare aircraft, and we'll carry on tasking in half an hour's time. Sheepishly went into the engineers and said, look, I'm really sorry, but we've broken one of your aircraft. Can we have a new one, please? And they were like, oh, caused us so much paperwork and so much hassle. Meanwhile, our sister aircraft shut down the aircraft. They had looked at us, and they ran in, and they're like, that round that's gone through the engine, how on earth has it managed to keep going? And we're like, what round through the engine? We'd only found one through the belly of the aircraft. So we went running back out, had a look. The engineers pulled back the dust particle separator, which sort of mounted to the front of the engine, slid it back, and it had gone through the gearbox, which is mounted on the front of the engine, and it had gone right through. And the engineers were like, we have no idea how this thing didn't rip itself to shreds. And it should have done. It should have given way, it should have ripped itself up, caused a massive explosion, and we would only be flying on the other engine. Now, you can fly with one engine if you're at the right weight. However, when you're hot, you're high at 3,000 feet, you're at 50 degrees, and you've got an underslung load, there is a really good chance you're going to be going down. Definitely with an underslung load. We were right up at our max all that weight. There was no way we were going to be able to fly with one engine. 30 seconds after we'd been hit, we were crossing the lake. Had we lost that engine, it would have probably failed right over the middle of the lake, in which case we would have been going in. Even if we'd got a chance to pickle the load and get rid of it, there's a good chance that we would have ended up landing in the lake, in which case you've got to get out of a sinking Chinook with, we used to fly with wing body armour in front of our door, or this side. You'd have to unload this body armour, then take the door off through a sinking aircraft, push it out, and then we were wearing sort of body armour ourselves, and I have about sort of 60 or 90 rounds strapped to us, and all of that weight, we then got to swim out and be able to get away. Thankfully, that didn't happen. And the following day, we were transiting, it was late at night, and it was about a 16-hour day, transiting across the Red Desert back to Kandahar. And one of the crewmen, Anna, she spoke up, and she was like, Rich, what happened to your mate yesterday? And what she was asking was, Rich, I know you're a Christian, I know you trust God, and I know that you believe that God's going to keep you safe. I know that last tour, in your first tour of Afghanistan, you didn't get shot at. However, God allowed you to be shot at. Does that mean there is no God? There's no such thing as a God because God allowed you to be hit. And that's what she was saying with what happened to your mate yesterday. And I said, Anna, God did keep us safe yesterday. I said, that engine should have ripped itself to shreds. We would have landed in Kajaki, and there's a good chance everybody would have been killed. I said, that didn't happen. The engine, miraculously, carried on working for another 45 minutes on the way back to Camp Bastion. I said, God did keep us safe yesterday, and in fact, whenever I fly, he puts angels around the aircraft, and as we're flying now, there's 4 angels around this aircraft. And I said it with the confidence that I had because I trusted in God and because I knew that I had a church family and I had my own family who were praying for my safety when I was back in the UK. And I said it, and there was something like, oh, I really hope we do have some angels around this aircraft. And I couldn't see them, but I just said it with the real confidence that I had, that I knew that my life was in God's hands. Anyway, that was one story. If I may fast forward to the 5th deployment of Afghanistan, and we were tasked with moving some building material from one of the patrol bases, literally just a mile to the other side of what was a ring of mines. And every time they'd go out on patrol, there was a ring of IEDs, improvised explosive devices, that had been dug in, that whenever the patrol would go out, they would stumble across these mines, either be blown up by them, or be caught by them, or often they would discover them, but then have to fall onto their hands and knees and spend the next hour trying to dig them up, deactivate them, blow them up. And it would stop their patrols ever from leaving, so they couldn't actually get on with anything. Meanwhile, they'd also then get ambushed, and they would have to sit under small arms fire and have to fight their way back to the patrol base. So they were totally hemmed in. The idea was to move the patrol base from where it was, about a mile the other side, and we had to take some building material for them to be able to go and build it. So it was a particularly dangerous part of Afghanistan. We'd been briefed, this operation cannot, under any circumstances, happen during daylight. It must happen under the cover of darkness. So we were all really aware of the intelligence picture. They then showed us a landing site of where they wanted us to land. There was a desert on one side, and then there was a horseshoe of buildings and compounds around the field that they wanted us to land. And the IMP officer showed us a map of the historical firing points, and there were red dots all covering from pretty much every single building where they knew that people had been shot from these buildings. And they wanted us to land right in the middle of it. So we're like, okay, we know what's going to happen. So we got up at so the day before, there was a Brit soldier sadly killed, shot in the head, on the field because they were patrolling in that area. He'd been shot and killed on that field. And they wanted us still to go ahead. They said, yeah, it's too important, we're going to plan and go ahead with this mission. So we got up at 2, we breakfast at 3, briefed at 4, walked at 5, but it was about an hour before the sun had rose, and we launched to go and pick up this building material. The plan was literally pick up this underslung load, move it, drop it, go home. That was it. So everything went to plan, we picked the load up, and as we lifted the load, they were like, cancel, right, abort. Because we'd already committed, we couldn't put it back down. We were transitioning forward. We then disappeared off into the desert. Went off to the desert to hold at low level about 10 miles away, just so that our noise signature would be too far away to kind of wake everyone up. And they then said, yeah, we can. They intercepted some enemy communications, and they said, yeah, they can see the Chinook, and they're getting the big weapon ready to be able to take it out. They used to call it a fat cow. So yes, the fat cow was the Chinook, and they're getting the big weapon to take out the fat cow. So we knew that we'd been spotted. We knew that they'd probably got a good idea of what we were up to. And we then had to wait for 10 minutes. Meanwhile, it was getting lighter and lighter. We then had to wait another 10 minutes. And it was getting even lighter. And then eventually the sun rose, and we were like, okay, that's it. So we were like, so just to confirm, this is a mission scrub. We're going to reset, go back, and we'll try another day. And they said, no, we've decided it's too important. We're going to go ahead. And the commander back at Bastion was like, no, I'm happy to take the risk. And I'm like, okay, well, you might be happy to take the risk of losing a Chinook, but we're the ones actually taking the risk. Anyway, and then at that point, it went deathly silent on the intercom. Nobody spoke. We just sat there, orbiting at about sort of 80 feet with this underslung load, thinking, what's going to happen? And eventually, Chris, our crewman, spoke up, and he was like, Rich, I hope you're praying. And I said, I am praying. And actually, I can only think of 2 occasions that I was praying really hard in the aircraft. That was one of them. And I said, Chris, yeah, I am praying. And I said, and actually, Chris, don't worry about it. Nothing is going to happen. I said, I feel that I've got huge confidence that God's got this, that actually God's going to protect us. We're going to drop this underslung load in. Nothing is going to happen. In fact, we're not even going to get shot at, and we'll fly home. And again, I said it without really thinking about what I was saying, and all of a sudden I was like, oh God, now you're really going to have to, because I had been praying, but I was like, oh Lord, I've said it with huge confidence, you're going to have to show up now, because I've said it, and now if we do get shot, they're going to turn around and be like, well, your God doesn't exist, or, your prayers weren't answered. We were eventually cleared in. They said, yeah, okay, you're cleared in. They've managed to, work out what it was that was going on. You cleared in. We cleared in, dropped the load off, flew home, and nothing happened. And the reason I share that story is partly it's one of the most uneventful stories that happened during my sort of 5 tours of Afghanistan. But I really feel like it was an answer to prayer, that God had protected me on that day, and I think probably the cynics could probably explain it away, well, it was never going to happen anyway. But certainly from my point of view, and the circumstances building up to it, there was every reason why we should have been and could have been shot at. And we weren't. And we managed to get home unscathed. Anyway, fast forward a little bit more. I've got one final story. So this is now my 4th tour of Afghanistan. And again, it was another deliberate operation. They had found a particular drug lord that was processing huge amounts of opium, or sort of heroin, turning it into opium. They used to then send the opium across the border into Pakistan, sell all the drugs, buy loads of weapons, and then flood all of this southern part of Afghanistan with loads of weapons. And there was a definite sort of fighting season. As the weather got better in April, May, all the foreign fighters would bring loads of weapons into Afghanistan, harass all the locals, and then by sort of September, October, and the first snow start to fall, it would then kind of peter off, and during the winter months, not as much would happen. But the idea was to stop all of this, this opium being processed. And there was 3 particular compounds. And there was a dedicated Special Forces squadron, Chinook squadron, that would work with the Special Forces. However, they needed to go by daylight because the 2 Chinooks would only operate at night. So it came over to us, and we weren't Special Forces, but we were carrying the Special Forces on that day. So it was 4th of April 2011, and there's a reason why I remember that date. And it was about a 20 minute hop from Bastion. So Camp Bastion, we went across the Red Desert, landed at 5 in the morning, just before the sun rose, and we dropped off 35 troops in each Chinook, landed them on. They ran out, found these loads of IED making materials, loads of weapons. They found 4.5 tons of processed opium. We dropped them off. They spent 4 hours on their patrol. We lifted, flew back to Bastion, and were sat there at Bastion waiting for them to call and say we're ready. Now normally we'd just go with 1 Apache escort. On this occasion, they decided to put 2 up because they knew how dangerous it was. So there's 2 Apaches looking over the patrol and making sure that there's no sort of suspicious activity going on. And then above that, there was the UAVs, the F-18, and the various different, there was sort of about 6 different aircraft in a stack above that, just because it was a fairly important mission. So they had huge eyes in terms of what was going on. We were eventually called in 4 hours later, right, you're cleared for the extract, go and pick them up. We were about 10 minutes, about halfway there, so about 10 minutes from landing, and we heard the 2 Apaches asking for the next level up, or the highest level in rules of engagement. They said, we've just seen 2 men running out of a compound, and they're hiding in a tree line. And they didn't fancy taking on 70 SAS soldiers, but what they did fancy a chance of is taking out the Chinook. Because if they took out the Chinook, they could kill everyone in one fell swoop. But because they weren't actively engaged in shooting under the rules of engagement, the Apaches weren't allowed to engage in taking these 2 men out. So they said, look, we know what they're up to, they're running out of these compounds, they're lying in wait, do we have permission to take them out? Permission was granted, they took these 2 guys out, or missed, as the case may have been. And so we knew that actually it was going to be fairly a hot landing, as it were, when we were actually cleared into land. So we dropped into low level a little bit early, we test-fired we've got 2 miniguns, 1 machine gun, test-fired all our weapons, which we wouldn't use offensively, but we would use defensively. So if someone started shooting us, we'd often maybe shoot back, but it was more just to get them to duck their heads. Meanwhile, we'd then be off the horizon. within a matter of seconds, more to just defend ourselves. We varied our routing ever so slightly. We saw these 2 sticks of troops, 35 troops in each. Both Chinooks came in. We went over the top of them, landed just past them. I was sat in the left-hand seat. The other pilot was stood in the right-hand seat. He was the guy who was flying. And as we landed, he was controlling his feet were on the pedals. He lifted his feet up to tiptoe on the brakes to bring the aircraft to a stop. As he lifted his feet up, bang! There was a bullet that went underneath his legs, through the centre console, and then it went over my right toe and into my left foot. So I brought my boot. So this is the boot. Have a look at it later. There we go. There's a little bullet hole. There's a picture of the X-ray actually. Do you want to have a look at that? There we go. So my colleagues ribbed me for ages. They were like, "Rich, you didn't actually get shot by the Taliban, did you? You've actually pulled your pistol out and shot yourself in the foot, like they used to do in the First World War." I was like, "No, really, honestly, I was shot." Anyway, so we were stranded on this landing site with 35 troops. The captain put out a contact report, contact, to let the other aircraft know. The crewmen started screaming to the troops, "Get on, get on!" And we had a rule of 1 boot on, all boots on, so that the moment one person had stepped on the aircraft, we didn't lift, and we were sat there until everybody was on, because we didn't want to leave half the people on the ground, half the people on the aircraft. So we were sitting ducks, but we were only on the ground for about 30 seconds, as you saw from the clip earlier. They were as quick as exiting the aircraft as they were getting on. And then we lifted and flew away from the little village that was out to our right-hand side. We flew off to the left and back to Bastion. And I remember arming the aircraft up so all our defensive aids would work again, and all our flares would work automatically. And I said, "Get us back to the hospital." And our crewmen had missed all the kerfuffle, because I remember, because the moment I'd been shot, there was one of those pregnant. You know when you touch something hot, your first reaction is to pull your finger back. Exactly the same thing had happened to me. The first thing that I'd done was to pull my foot back, but it took me a good full second to realise, oh, rubbish, I've been shot. And the pain didn't really, although it was painful, it wasn't excruciatingly painful. That wasn't, it hurt a lot. But I could still function, and I was still able to talk, still be able to. So I said, "Oh, rubbish, I've been shot." But he missed, the crewman in the back missed it. So as I said, "Let's fly to hospital." He's like, "Why, have you been hurt?" I was like, "Yes, I have been." And from my point of view, I remember, if you stand up too quickly after having a hot bath or something, you get the kind of that grey feeling where you can't really, And I remember feeling that, and I could hear my captain asking me questions, but I couldn't respond. From his point of view, he was like, "Rich, you went unconscious, you couldn't respond to anything I was saying." Eventually one of the crewmen leant forward, started slapping me around the face, was like, "Rich, it's probably best you unstrap." And I was like, "Okay, I can hear everything you're saying, I just can't see." And I'd lost my sight. I think it was probably just the shock had finally set in, rather than the pain or anything else. So I unstrapped, climbed out, lay down the back. The moment I was lying back on the back of the Chinook, all the blood came back to my head, and I could, I was absolutely fine. Long story short, I had an operation to remove the round. So yeah, there's another X-ray. So this is at Camp Bastion, I was then flown back that evening in a C-17 all the way back to Birmingham, where they then cleaned and stitched it. And amazingly, it didn't do a huge amount of damage. This is a picture of it going through the cockpit. That's the window, and you can just about make out, it's not a very clear picture, but that is the hole where it went underneath, that's its entry hole, that's where it went through, and I was sat on the other side. This little plate here is where the person's foot, the other pilot's foot would have been. So he lifted his feet up, and the bullet went underneath his feet, so he was sort of very, very lucky to get away with it. And then this is back at me in the UK, back at Birmingham Hospital, where I had it cleaned and stitched. And all I ended up with was one small little fracture on the cuneiform. And basically, I got back into work 6 weeks later. I was back in the cockpit 7 weeks later, and I was back to Afghanistan. I was shot in April, and back in Afghanistan that November. Anyway, long story short, 2 years later, I found out that my foot was still fractured. And it had never properly recovered. And I'd been walking and running and flying on a fractured foot for 2 years. They then stopped me flying, had it operated on to try and pin the fracture, but it hadn't had a blood supply for 2 years, so it didn't work. So they reoperated, they put loads of scaffolding in my foot, trying to fuse two of the bones together, but in the process made it a whole lot worse. And eventually, they were like, Rich, we're going to have to medically discharge you from the Air Force. And it threw up a huge amount of sort of uncertainty in my life, because a huge amount of, probably, you as blokes, a huge amount of what you do is caught up, your identity is caught up in your profession, in your job. But being a Christian, I feel like my identity isn't caught up just in what I do. Now, at the time, I was a Chinook pilot, I was combat ready. My identity was very much caught up in, well, this is what I do, I'm in the Royal Air Force, so if I can't ever fly again, what on earth am I going to do, and where do I go from here? But actually, my identity, I feel, is in Christ Jesus and not in just my job. However, it still threw up all the emotions of being like, oh, Lord, what am I going to do with my life and where do I go? And again, a bit of a long story short, I ended up being medically discharged, and they said, actually, you're unfit for further military service, you're unable to run anymore. I was unable to pass the fitness test, you're out. Amazingly, I was still able to get a civilian aviation medical, because actually the civilian doctor said, well, as long as you can get in and out of a cockpit safely, actually that's fine. We don't expect you to be able to run and pass a military fitness test, and you don't have to escape and evade in case you get shot down or anything. So I was able to get a civilian medical, which allowed me to carry on to flying. So I then had to spend another £30,000 as I left the military to get a civilian aviation license, and then started applying for jobs all over the world, just because there were just no jobs in the UK. Eventually, someone emailed me and said, would you like to take a co-pilot job on the air ambulance at Norwich? So one thing led to another. I said yes, and I found myself in 2015 flying the air ambulance. So for the last 7 years, I've been flying this, which has been great fun. So I moved to Norwich. My brother was like, you must meet this girl, Ruth. He lived in Norwich, I was moving up, and so the weekend before I started work, I came up to visit. He introduced me to Ruth, and she said, well, we're in a 5-bedroom house, we've got a spare bedroom. If you want to move in, we've got a spare bedroom. And because we ended up being housemates, that's how I got to know Ruth. That's how one thing led to another. I met John's daughter. So there we go. A little bit of background there. So, how are we doing for time? Oh, yeah, okay. I've got a few stories which I should share with you about the air ambulance. The model around the country is for it to be a single pilot operation. However, East Anglian Air Ambulance have got 2 aircraft, one based at Norwich Airport, one based at Cambridge. They said they wanted it to be multi-pilot, which is actually a lot safer, and partly because we do 24 hours now with night vision goggles and we fly with a big torch. It's far better to have 2 pilots. So the crew is normally 2 pilots, 1 doctor, 1 paramedic. We're on standby for immediate notice move to go and support the ambulance service all over Norfolk, Norwich, the whole of East Anglia. So there's actually 5 aircraft in the region. East Anglian Air Ambulance have got 2, there's Magpass, which have got 1 at Huntingdon, and then there's Essex and Herts all the way down. And they're all controlled by 1 control centre, where the ambulance dispatcher, who's dispatching 3, 4, 5,000 ambulances in a day, would also control 5 aircraft. And if it reached a certain criticalness or seriousness of injury, they would then say, we've got a job for the doctor. And they would carry extra drugs and extra expertise. And in the back of the aircraft, it was basically like a mini flying A&E. And the main job was for us to take the doctor and all of the equipment to the patient, rather than having to wait for the patient to get to hospital. So occasionally we'd end up flying a patient as well back to hospital. The main job was being a delivery service for the doctor, being able to take him and his expertise and the paramedic. The paramedics actually, on the other hand, were actually probably often more qualified and more experienced than some of the doctors. But as a team, they used to work incredibly well. And we would throw ourselves in terms of carrying staff, running backwards, forwards, to and from the aircraft, just to try and help out. And so I thoroughly enjoyed it for the last however many years. And we used to land in a whole bunch of different places. I've got loads of photos, so I'll just quickly run through some of these. And so yeah, there's a farmer's field. We land on the beach. We can land in school playing fields. If that was the only place to land, opposite the school, someone was having a cardiac arrest. The only place we could land was in, and we wouldn't need permission from the landowner. We had dispensation to be able to land wherever we wanted. So, and most people were really thankful for us doing the service that we did. So we did. But what was quite fun about landing in schools, you'd get them have about 200 kids all, clambering all over the aircraft and having a look, which was quite fun. Quite difficult to see. That's landing in the mud, landing in the snow, landing next to rivers, lakes, in the summer, in the winter, on the beach again. A little bit about what we used to do. So about a third, of everything that we did was road traffic accidents, or RTCs. Road traffic collisions. And it would be either cars, it would be this is a turned over tractor that went around the corner too quickly with a trailer on, managed to roll it. About a third would be cardiac arrests, and because of the nature of how important it was to get to someone with a cardiac arrest quickly, it was better to send a doctor than wait for them to be able to come to hospital. So that was about a third of what we used to do. And the doctors could do a huge number of extra things that, say, the road ambulances maybe couldn't. And then about a third was then everything else. So it was sort of horse riding accidents, people's drownings, or people getting garden tools, chainsaws, all sorts of other things that they couldn't really categorise into anything else. Sort of other. So here's another one. This is a car that's sort of stuck halfway up a tree. And actually, the gentleman, there's one gentleman just climbing out. The woman that was in the left-hand seat is still stuck in there, but thankfully both of them walked away, and they were both absolutely fine. Time for a quick story, if I may. This particular gentleman, it was just outside of Holt. He was riding his motorbike behind another car, and as he went round the corner, there was a little bit of loose gravel, and he wasn't going particularly fast. I always think of motorbikes as like hooning along at sort of 100 miles an hour. He was following another vehicle. The vehicle was probably only doing about 40 miles an hour down this sort of country lane. And amazingly, the driver noticed that there was a motorbike in his rear view mirror. Went round the next corner, looked up, and he knew the road really well. It's like, there's no longer a motorbike there. So he pulled over, stopped, turned around, went back along the stretch of road, and went back along the stretch of road about 3 times, eventually parked up, walked back, and then he heard this guy groaning in a hedge. And he'd recognised that, there was no turn off, and the guy must have just come off, and he slipped his bike, went through the hedge, nearly lost his life with a tree. So you can actually see he came off the road in that gap up there, and ended up landing in this sort of thick bush. So by the time we got there, he was sort of all covered in blankets and everything else. But he'd come around this corner, up here, come around that corner, made this hole through the hedge, and he was just incredibly lucky not to hit that tree, which probably would have taken his life. And about 6 months later, he came back to us just to thank us and say, thank you so much, you've made a real difference. And had that driver not stopped, he probably would have ended up dying of hypothermia, because he would have been stuck out there. Sadly, he was paralysed from the waist down, and the guy was never able to walk again. And his partner at the time, they had 3 kids, he just came back. He was, and the reason I share this story, he was just one of the most positive people I think I've ever met. He was just so thankful. He just said, thank you, thank you, thank you. And we didn't really feel like we'd done much. We'd often get sent out 2 or 3 times a day, and often we'd get to the end of the day and I couldn't really remember what we'd been on, because they all kind of merged into one. But this guy really stood out just because he was so thankful. And anyway, it's just something really stands out. When you meet someone who's really thankful, it's really memorable. And yes, as mentioned before, everything we do by day, we also do by night. If we weren't flying, we'd often sort of be playing a little bit of table tennis around. I'll share just one quick story, if I may. Sorry. We got called out for a job First thing in the morning, we landed here was for a cardiac arrest, and this was our first landing in the morning. And if you have a look at the size of the house, not particularly big. Our second job of the morning, we landed next to this massive big stately home. And as we got airborne to go to this, we would just, as pilots, we'd run out to the aircraft. Meanwhile, the paramedic would take the details of the patient, and what it was. It was a horse rider, it was a cardiac arrest, it was a road traffic accident. We would then get airborne and find out, right, so what is it? And Sam, she spoke up, she was like, you'll never believe this. A man has been shot out of a human cannonball. A human cannon, and he's fractured both his ankles. So we landed next to this stately home, and en route, they said, this is a picture from above, they were like, right, be careful, there's several other helicopters already on site. And we wondered whether we were going to go to a circus or something like that. And actually you can see from the air, you can see there's one little helicopter there, there's another one there, and there's actually two more that are kind of hidden behind the trees. So there were 4 helicopters kind of all over the site of this stately home. Landed on, walked through the corridor, this dingy corridor, and saw this man lying there, and he was in his sort of early 30s, and he all looked a little bit sheepish, and we were like, what happened? And he said, I was struck from underneath with a platform, and I managed to break my legs. And we were like, do you mean the human cannon that you shot yourself out of? And he goes, oh yeah, I just didn't want to mention. And he said, oh yes, well I just invited some friends over for a Saturday to do a little bit of motorbiking and human cannoning, and we're shooting ourselves into the lake. And you can just about see where we landed. That little 4x4 is by the lake, and it was towing this giant human cannon. And we said, well, you do have some strange hobbies, don't you? And he said, it is a Saturday, don't you know? So, anyway, we ended up flying him back to Norfolk and Norwich Hospital. Yeah, one of the most sort of more unusual places that we landed. So it's landing on a roundabout in Norwich. And yes, and then I left that in February last year, so the last 12 months I've been doing something different. One of the main reasons I've left the job that I was doing, I loved what I was doing, was because they moved to doing a 24-hour operation. And actually, we've got 2 small boys. We were expected to do a 12-hour night shift, maybe starting on a Friday, finishing on a Saturday morning. I would then try and go home, look after 2 boys, and I feel like my role is a full-time dad and a full-time husband, and some of the time I go to work. And actually my responsibility, I felt, was more important to be able to spend time with my family. And I wasn't giving them the best, and I was grumpy with my kids, I was short with Ruth, and I felt that actually I couldn't be doing this long-term. And it was using 6 out of 8 weekends because it was a rolling shift pattern throughout the year. And I was just not sleeping a huge amount and getting all a bit tired and grumpy, so I thought it's probably time to leave. So I text a friend, if you ever hear of anything coming up doing offshore bits and pieces, please let me know. So what I currently fly at the moment is this, which is, and my role is still a pilot, but I'm just a taxi service now for people going to work. And I've been flying from Norwich for 7-8 years, and know Norfolk and East Anglia really well. But the moment you coast out and you go out to sea, there is a whole other world out there. And there's ferries, and there's ships, and there's wind turbines, and there's hundreds of sort of gas platforms, and a whole kind of industry. And yeah, so our job is to fly a minibus with 16 seats to fly people to work. So we fly people out to the rigs. I was flying yesterday morning, and we fly, the platform that we mainly go to is about 120 miles north of here. And yeah, there's 2 rigs, one of them is manned, one of them is not, and we pick some people up, so we fly people out, pick some people up, drop them off at work, and then in the evening we'll go and pick them up and drop them back and fly back. So yeah, as I'm sure you've all heard many, many times before, the aircraft flying out. So that's our main role. And this is what we go to, just so you know, so that's the platform that we go to, and they come in all different shapes and sizes. But yeah, you can just about see, it's really small to see. They're actually huge. You see that there's about 10 or 15 people stood on the edge of the platform there. So it just sort of shows you how big some of these structures can be in the middle of the ocean. And that's us taking a bit of a refuel. And that's about all I've got time for. Oh. Anyway, thank you for listening. And for having me this morning. But yeah, are there any questions about what I do or Robbie, go on.
Is it true?
Oh, in fact, there's a microphone coming towards you.
Is it true you fell out of your emotions and ended up at A&E?
Not quite. I jumped out of the air ambulance and managed to twist my ankle very badly. This was about a week before I left and I was starting this new job. And so we then flew our patient to A&E, and I was unable to walk. I properly injured my ankle, and I got the other pilot to fly while I was kind of nursing my injured foot. But I got the other pilot to run in, grab some ice from Costa, and run back out and wrap it in a sock and be able to. But yes. Any other questions?
Did you?
One here at the front.
It's simple. Did you keep the bullet?
Ah, you know what? No, I didn't. Sadly, it was taken off for forensics. So they said, "Oh, I'm sorry, we can't give it to you." They can find fingerprints and blood and work out where it's come from, and if it comes from Iran, if it comes from China, if it comes from Russia, they can work out, and if they can stop the supply chain there, it can help. So I've got similar ones. I can pass these around if you want, but yeah, a little bit of metal, it's quite difficult to see, but yeah, that's the sort of size of bullet of a 7.62 round that ended up. But yeah, so sadly not. I did keep him in the boot, but not the bullet. Yeah.
Any more? Any more questions? Yes.
All right, thank you. Rich, did you, this is a bit more of a serious question, did you ever experience any questioning or conflict between your faith and your role in military operations at all?
No, not often, and rarely. I can think of one conversation in the 11 years that I had in the Air Force where I was asked about my faith. And I think one of the things that I really struggled with was the apathy from my colleagues. And I can see it from their point of view. We'd grown up through I was a similar age, similar stage. I joined university, I joined the Air Force, we'd gone through all the training all together. They were hugely successful in their own eyes. They were combat-ready Chinook pilots. There's only about 100 Chinook pilots in the country. They were one of them. They were going out with, they'd got girlfriends or wives, or sometimes both girlfriends and wives, with successful jobs in the city and everything else. Actually, their view of God was that God was a crutch to lean on in times of need. And from their point of view, I'd be like, that's not how I see God. And actually, I see God as someone who provides peace, and actually, in times of difficulty, I can pray, and I can rely on Him. And I see the more I pray, the more I see God's answers to prayer. The one question or conversation I did have was of a guy who wasn't interested in the answer. He was just being antagonistic, and he deliberately waited until we were about 15 or 20 of us. We sat around in the evening at the end of a long day in Afghanistan. He was like, "So tell me, Rich, am I going to hell?" And he wasn't interested in the answer, but I was very aware that it's not that I was answering his question, but there were 14 other people listening to what I said, and I just prayed for wisdom. I was like, God, what to say? And I think what I said then, and what I say now might be slightly different, but what I said was, I'm not the one who makes the decision. God is the one who makes the decision, and actually you live your life and get to the gates of heaven. God's the one who decides about whether you go to heaven or hell. I said, but you're the one asking me. So if you ask me, are you saying that I'm God? And I was like, I'm not God, I don't make the decision, that's between you and Him. What I may have said something different, and I've kind of probably had years to think about what I might have said, is probably like, I think you're asking the wrong question. You've made an assumption that there is a hell and that there isn't a hell. I said, that there is a hell. I said, I think maybe your question should go back a stage. Is there a hell or isn't there? And I said, because if your conclusion is that there isn't such a thing as a heaven and a hell, or right or wrong, if there's a God or not, if your conclusion is that there isn't such a thing as that, fine. Fill your boots, go and do whatever you like, kill as many people as you want, sleep with whoever you like, it makes no difference. Because we're all going to end up in the grave at some point, some of us sooner than later, but actually we could all die tomorrow in Afghanistan. But I said my conclusion is that there is, and that there's purpose to life, and that actually none of this has happened by accident, and we're all here because God's created us. And maybe I could have answered it a little bit differently. And maybe even that's not the best answer that you could probably give. But I think maybe just as a challenge for everyone who's here who may not think that actually God is real, I can testify today that He is. And that I believe there is a heaven and hell, and I live my life because I know where I want to go at the end of it. Anyway, hopefully I'll answer that.
Okay, I'm sure Rich will be around for a few more minutes if you want to grab hold of him and speak to him. But thank you very much, Rich, for coming and thank you for allowing your arm to be twisted to come and speak to us. And I hope you've enjoyed the breakfast and being with us today. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
And just add my thank you to that as well. I thought that was absolutely fantastic, Rich. Thank you so much for coming along and sharing.